Bruce, it's fantastic to see you again. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. How are you? The
Yeah,
end
very
of
well.
summer, we've survived another year.
Well, luckily on the farm, it's looking pretty sunny right now. The rain clouds haven't quite hit yet, but the end is closing in on us, unfortunately.
Hmm.
Hopefully not in an existential sense, but you're right. The end of summer's coming.
You can't rule it out, can you, this year?
I know. That is the dark cloud literally hovering above our heads. Has everything been well with you during this kind of period?
Well, I managed to get away for a week. I went to Beirut and witnessed the biggest urban explosion in peacetime history. It wasn't the most relaxing week I've ever spent, to be honest. But there you go. You can't help but feel, that there's no point trying to escape when bad fortune follows you like that. It's worth caveating that the place I had been staying in 2 days before the explosion was completely destroyed. So just a touch of good fortune, I would say, is what I've experienced this year.
Well, firstly, I'm very glad you're well, considering,
I
and I
know.
hope, a lot of other people are well as well. I know some aren't, obviously, from that. But this has just occurred to me. Your achievements are even more remarkable now, because the last two times we've met, this time and the time before, the first interview at LSE, your daughter had fallen out of a tree and broken her arm, and I assume she's well now. And
It
this
was my
time,
son, but
oh,
yes.
your son,
Yeah.
sorry. And this time you've just avoided an explosion.
Yeah. That's a good reminder. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So well, look, I'm very glad we actually went back to the Airbnb, which was this beautiful. Beirut's like this wonderful, chaotic, anarchic place, and we'd hired a beautiful Airbnb for a trivial amount of cash. It was like £100 a night. Trivial for my privileged position, but we'd hired a beautiful Airbnb with a pool, and so we went back the next day just to see how they were all getting on, and like the place was destroyed. So I can't help but through moments like this, there's a degree of narcissism in terms of how we interpret the world. Someone who we all view the world through our own subjective experience. If we can relate to the person suffering, and so I can't help but feel that I've been incredibly fortunate, rather than I definitely witnessed a lot of tragedy while I was there.
Yeah, no, and we'll get on to some of this later as well. But before we do, we've got a couple of quick questions just to get to know you, even though I think we're already getting a pretty good sense from that opening. But so you were the VP of Twitter, or EMEA VP Twitter, before doing your own stuff now. Who's your favorite person you follow on Twitter?
It does vary, actually. For a long time, my most joyous experience of Twitter was I adore pop music. I generally don't listen to music older than a couple of months old, and not out of sort of any obstinate neophilia. Not like I only love stuff that no one else has heard, but because I listen to music so sort of obsessively that once I've listened to something a bit, I get bored of it. So for a long time, my favorite person on Twitter was a guy called Peter Robinson, who he tweets under the name Pop Justice, and he tweets a lot less these days. To be honest, my focus of my social media is broadly now based on two things: US politics and tennis. So when we're recording this, we're in the middle of the US Open. So I always love following this guy, Ben Rosenberg. There's a guy, Chris Clancy from the New York Times, who's a wonderful journalist. And David Law is a British journalist who is on tennis. But, I'm obsessive about American politics. And as we record this, we're 65 days away from the US election. So it's generally something related to that. And, that will almost certainly be someone who's a journalist from the New York Times or something like that. No one in particular, but I've got a very finely curated timeline of American politics.
Okay. And I hope we're not keeping you from like a tennis game you really wanted to watch.
Thankfully, it's not really getting going for another hour and a half.
Okay, so that's the hard cut off it. There we go. Okay, you're a workplace culture expert. You know, you're a real master of this now. But are you a Monday or a Friday person?
That's interesting. I love the transition of Monday. You know, I sort of I think the to use a pop music analogy, Fridays are a sort of a little bit repeat to fade, meaning sort of the
Yeah,
Fridays are a wind down,
yeah,
whereas
yeah,
Monday mornings often have a feeling of being plunged into cold water and getting on with it. So yeah, I love relaxing, but I love the crack of getting on with it. So I guess I'm a Monday person.
Well, I've just got this visual image now of being on the edge of like a giant diving board with some cold ocean below, and that's what Monday morning is to you. So you're a
Yeah,
thrill seeker, it sounds like.
yeah. I mean, I'm not sure you'd put Monday morning enthusiast and thrill seeker next to each other, but yes, I enjoy my down times as well as my up times.
Okay, okay. My last question, quick question before we get into it. What is, out of all the interviews you've done, what do you think's one that you've enjoyed the most? Maybe a
Um,
hard question.
Yeah, most of my interviews. So I do a podcast on workplace culture and eat, sleep, work, repeat, and it's driven by my own personal interest. So I'm very fortunate now that I do get authors pitched to me, and I get sort of the likes of Seth Godin, or I get big authors of sort of big books pitched to me, and generally my favorite interviews are the ones where I follow my own curiosity and own
Ah,
passion. Immediately after this, I'm chatting to someone who is a community organizer, because I'm convinced that the future of workplaces is going to have community organizers and community managers at the heart of them. So I love things like that. My favorite interview of all was a woman called Zeynep Ton, who's in
okay.
fact a professor of logistics of operations at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And she set about, I think, making the empirical case for good workplace culture. So she studies retail stores, supermarkets, and she discovered that companies that set about creating a good working environment for their workers seem to be considerably more profitable, considerably more successful than those that don't. And so, and like the really interesting, describing a book on operations, a book on workplace culture, there's a couple of moments that um, are really emotional. She talks about a a Down syndrome at work at one retail store, and everyone in the retail store was having a hard time. So everyone was asked to think of one thing that they could do to make the store more successful. And he wrote little notes, sort of kind thoughts that he put into people's shopping bags.
Oh,
And the
wow.
store couldn't understand why why the queue for this one checkout was so much longer than everyone else's. And it sort of was such a lovely moment of humanity that just reminded me that so often we find ourselves sort of living out work and living out our careers like cells in a spreadsheet. And whenever we bring a touch of humanity to what we do, not only is it deeply enriching, but actually it just makes everything seem more worthwhile. And I was so taken with her book. Zeynep Tun's a real inspiration, because she realized through her work that she realized that, not only was this good that you could make workplaces better for people, but in addition, she realized that in aggregate, the evidence was really strong for it. So she said, okay, I wonder then if I could set myself a mission of trying to make 10 million people's jobs better. And
Oh,
so she set up a
Jesus.
foundation on it. And in fact, Walmart approached her and she said, well, if you're serious about making your employees' jobs better, then I'm very willing to help you. But it's a lot of work from where you are right now. And I just loved sometimes we feel morally conflicted if someone makes a moral case for something, but then he's asked to make the empirical case for it as well. We shouldn't have to argue the empirical
Mm,
case of why Black
yeah,
Lives Matter. It should be just
yeah.
morally that these things matter. And so, people might feel that the moral case for making people's jobs better is unarguable. But I think that I'm really inspired with the work that she's done. So it was a really lovely chat. sort of left me thinking about a lot of things. You know, retail stores are not necessarily the first place you think of when you think of good workplace cultures, but I think Zeynep was a real inspiration on that.
Awesome. That's awesome. Well, I hope people check that out after this. I've actually been enjoying a good few of your episodes. Seen the one about the Netflix document, the how Harry Styles changed workplace culture. That was another good one. Yeah, definitely recommend people check it out.
Any moment reflecting on Harry Styles is a moment well spent.
Or a moment you can't get back.
Harry Styles is certainly the man of the year for me. I adored that record. Maybe Harry Styles can save us.
Okay. No, I'll take your word for it. And building on this, you know, how is it the workplace culture for you went from being something that was an interesting topic to, you know, I'll quit my Twitter VP job to pursue this? How did that happen?
Yes, so broadly what happened is that I made a calamitous mistake. And it was in the act of digging myself out of that I became sort of connected and transfixed with what was there to do. So broadly what happened was I found myself guilty of what I think a lot of managers might do, bosses might do. They think that the best thing that they can possibly do is be the provider, the purveyor of good news. And so, and we witnessed some of this in the way that different leaders have responded to the COVID pandemic. Those who've stood on platforms saying we're going to have world-beating solutions and we're going to have the very, very best of the best, and it's all about to get better, have often found themselves having created unrealistic expectations and created false optimism. And I was definitely guilty of that. Twitter was a business that was having problems. It was going through traditional ups and downs that I think a lot of firms have, but we were having them really graphically. And I found myself erring on the side of being the cheerleader for why things were going to get better. And what you discover when that happens is if things don't get better, that people find themselves in a state of dissonance where emotionally they feel that, hang on, I was told that things were going to get better. And then rationally, they have this sort of a series of family, friends, colleagues saying, have you seen the latest article about Twitter? And, you know, they're in this position of dissonance. It's a little bit, whenever we find ourselves in conflict like that, there's normally a long process where we initially find ourselves arguing with these naysayers. And there is normally a moment where we realize that the tsunami of evidence against what we initially believed is becoming overwhelming, and we suddenly turn. And so, you know, I witnessed about 40% of our London office left in 1 year, and it forces you to, I think, either decide that 2/5 of the workforce were half-witted fools, or you're forced to confront, right, okay, something's gone wrong and maybe I'm responsible for it. So I set about thinking, you know, as a mea culpa, what can I do to try and understand what has gone wrong at my workforce, what I can do to try and make things better. And I started looking into it really. Candidly, I was looking for a nice, easy to read book on Amazon about workplace culture. And what I discovered was there's no easy book that I could grab off the shelves. And so I ended up searching for evidence and making one myself, really. I started off with a podcast. The podcast was just, like I've mentioned before, just a path of curiosity. So it was just an attempt for me to maybe pick the brains of intelligent people. I've done over 100 episodes now, and it became, you know, self-directed learning, really. I would find something fascinating. I would find something intriguing, and I would normally contact the professor behind it and ask to speak to them. So, it was sort of self-directed learning. And what I discovered along the way, I think what was the real epiphany for me was that I discovered along the way that there was a whole load of research, of evidence that would help any of us improve our workplaces, make work better. And very little of it was reaching people in jobs. And so, you know, this became sort of a penny drop moment for me when I discovered that open plan offices had terrible research against them, or when I discovered that, you know, the various other flaws in the way we were working. Interruptions are one of the worst things that we can be beset by. And so as I was discovering each of these things, I was thinking, wow, work to a large extent is a lie that we tell ourselves. Work is sort of this tissue of lies. And if we could only disabuse ourselves of these untruths, then we might be able to make work better for all of us.
So when you're digging into this research and I didn't even realize this. So there was no original passion. It was just, out of practicality, you need to work out what was going on. Digging through this research. Oh yeah, go on.
I think from a subjective experience, I always I was very fortunate that I worked in some really good places. And, so I worked for part of a radio group, and we used to meet our peers who worked in other radio companies. And it was evident that we were enjoying ourselves more, but also more successful than them. And so it was a curiosity I always had. And everyone who worked at this part of a company often used to speak very fondly of the culture, of the dynamic that existed there. And so, I think from a lay person's interest, I always had a curiosity with work, but it wasn't necessarily something that I'd ever expected to turn into semi-academic study, really.
And when you're doing this research, was there like a moment where you thought, what, actually, this is it, this is what I want to do? Or was it just did it just kind of take you over without you even realizing?
Yeah, it was gradual, really. So I found myself, what happened was I was doing this podcast, and the podcast very much was, to be sort of candid about it. It was me traveling in my downtime to go and meet people, or me contacting US professors after a day at work, then editing it at the weekends and then putting it out. And it was sort of like this, I think, in the same way that some people play golf, some people watch sports. I was just doing this as a distraction, really. And people used to contact me when I'd done about 20 episodes, and it had developed quite a following. People contacted me saying, "Oh, I wonder if you'd like to come in and do a lunchtime talk here about what you've learned." And then I ended up doing a couple of conferences about that. And then it sort of developed into something where I was getting more and more requests. And in fact, my podcast became number one business podcast. And while it was number one business podcast, Penguin Books contacted me saying, would you be interested in turning this into a book? So, at no step of the way did I ever have a overt, explicit plan of what I wanted to do. It was more, my advice, and I strongly sort of give this advice to anyone, is that if you ever feel like you're in a rut, in a hole, or wanting to discover something, then start doing stuff. Because the very act of starting to do stuff, whether it is learning what works, what doesn't work, whether it's the stimulation you get from meeting random people. One of my best friends is one of the people I interviewed on the podcast now. And so, you find yourself in very unexpected situations from these scenarios. So look, just have a go, experiment, do stuff. I think that would be my strong advice.
And is that kind of, because sometimes people have a voice in their head, or something on their shoulder, they feel like it's whispering to them, and they ignore it, like, I can't do that or whatever. Is that do stuff like connected with that, or is that literally just like, if you don't know what you're doing, just do random stuff and just see what happens?
I just think personally, I don't watch a lot of TV, but doing stuff, whether it's writing a diary, a journal, whether it's doing a podcast, learning photography, meeting people in any capacity. I think when you find yourself doing things, one of my other best friends, I didn't know a couple of years ago, and he's a poet. And I just love hanging. He's got a music studio. I love hanging with him. I love spending time with him. I think there is something really re-energizing about spending time with new people and sort of learning new things. And so, I always give the advice to people, if you're in any doubt, just start doing stuff, because number one, you'll discover whether you like it or not. And number two, like, new and stimulating opportunities come from it.
Okay, so you started, quite literally doing stuff, and it's turned into this fantastic workplace empire. I don't think you'd describe it like that, but
I've got a newsletter. That's about the extent of it.
and so with this now, with benefit of experience, what do you think great content looks like? Like what does a great interview look like, or whatever?
I definitely think I'm a novice in this. People who've gone to journalism school often pull me up on things that I do, and so obviously because I'm self-taught, I don't necessarily get these things right. Generally, what I've discovered is that, and I don't necessarily like it, but if you create something that's aimed to provoke, it tends to do better than something that's a kind reflection. I posted something on LinkedIn last week, which was all about. I'd posted something on LinkedIn about the government asking people to get back to work, and someone said, "Please keep the politics to Facebook." I'm not on Facebook, but please keep the politics off here. And then I posted a subsequent post about the reason why I felt that was wrong. I don't normally do things like that, but anyway, that second one,
truth's coming out.
Yeah, but that second one has got about 1,000 reactions to it, 1,000 comments. To be honest, it was stressing me out reading the comments, so I didn't read any of it. I stopped reading the comments. But it's just a good reminder, if you want to get some mileage, good content in that regard is optimizing for controversy. It just didn't necessarily make me happy to do that. So I generally create content that when I read it, I was fascinated about it. I think, my audience is tens of thousands on my podcast. It's, tens of thousands on my newsletter. And it's just specifically a very tight cohort of people who are interested in making work better. That's it. So, broadly as a result, if something intrigues me in that, I feel, okay, well, that will be intriguing for that audience as well. But it's a guessing process, really. I generally prefer something that feels substantial rather than feels provocative, is probably my take.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. And we've been working on this, marketing this, and just trying to produce things that we think would be valuable to people. But the provocative point is really interesting, because I think that's often something people feel maybe they should do, or I'm not really sure. If we could go deeper on that briefly, how do you deal with it when you're writing something and you think, oh, this makes me feel uncomfortable, but I know this could go well? How does that work for you?
Yeah, I just generally don't do stuff like that. So, I just, it'd be very easy on social media, definitely, for, to call people out, to be provocative. And most definitely people could find things that I've done that are along those lines. But generally, I would say when I'm sort of contemplating them afterwards, I don't feel happy about it. So, I'll give you one example, actually. A couple of weeks ago on my newsletter, I was trying to get someone who would give the alternative view. So I've got this very strong belief that we're not going to go back to the office 5 days a week. And so, nice. I met a few of my friends in Soho, and they said, "Oh, you're bananas. You're crazy." Of course we are. We're going, as soon as the vaccine comes, everyone, it's back to work 5 days a week. And it made me feel that I was in a bubble of people who thought like me. And so as a consequence, I said, free request here. I will give the newsletter over to anyone who wants to make the case for why coming back 5 days a week is helpful. And then I didn't get anything, but one guy sent me a link to something he'd written on LinkedIn. So I linked to it the next week. And because I'd put it in the context of me broadly saying I didn't believe, I wrote a newsletter saying, look, I'd asked for this. I wasn't convinced with any of the answers. Here's one guy, he said this. And because I'd basically included the link to his thing, but added a note that I wasn't convinced, he replied to me on an email, and he seemed quite upset by it, actually. He's like, oh, man, okay, damn. I just thought, I don't want to upset people. I just want to have an interesting debate. I don't want to be one of those people who's digging people out. Because I think there's more clicks and more retweets and more shares in it. So I tend to err on, which isn't to make it more anodyne, but I tend to err on the side of just not being deliberately hurtful, I think.
Well, you've learned that from experience as well. Like you say, you've had, you know, the occasional flutter with uh, animosity is not the right word, but you know, the politics thing, this thing, and I guess you've learned that it's not for you. So maybe that's the way people should approach it. Every now and again, experiment with the dark side, throw something out there a little bit controversial, and you know, see how it makes them feel. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, look, I just know it doesn't make me happy. And look, you know, it's worth saying I used to work at Twitter for 8 years. So I used to spend most weekends dealing with people who were on the receiving end of what they regarded as, you know, a tough time at the hands of social media. So I know very firsthand, you know, pretty much my every Saturday night was filled with me trying to help real people out who were sort of having a tough time. So I know firsthand, you know, the way that people can inadvertently find themselves getting into these things, and how it can be, you know, our mind catastrophizes when we're in the midst of a social media storm. Our mind believes that, you know, this is permanent, it's going to be prevalent across our whole life, sort of, it's all pervasive, sort of these 3 or 4 P's of catastrophization. So, you know, so, you know, I sort of witness it, and it just doesn't make me happy. You know, when I go to my phone, there's someone else ranting about something I've said. I'm like, oh man, I just wanted to have a discussion. I
Yeah, yeah.
didn't want to upset anyone.
Yeah, I think I'd be a bit like that, to be honest. If we, not that this would happen because we screen everything past our guests before we release it, but if we did release something and they weren't happy with it, I would, yeah, I'd be like, oh, it's a bit shit. Wasn't really planning on that.
Yeah, no, release what you want.
Yeah, yeah,
Release.
this will be the one then.
Yeah,
You'll
release
see
what you
it in 2 months' time. You'll be like, what? I didn't say any of that. What's going on?
want.
Okay, okay. So one thing as well. So reading your book that had me thinking, and based on what you were saying before as well about how you discovered workplace culture, is that your book kind of makes the case to me that actually a lot of the reason we feel dissatisfied with work is not so much because we're missing some overarching passion, but there could be like lots of little tweaks we can make that would actually make our experience much better. So that may be the completely wrong interpretation, but based on that, do you think we need passion?
Yeah, my take was broadly this, that, you know, that I found that a lot of the best organizations I'd ever worked in had been, you know, I've worked in sort of, you know, a dozen restaurants and then 5 or 6 workplaces, but I've been in various teams along the way of those places. And almost without exception, the best places I worked in were good, irrespective of the boss. And, you know, it wasn't necessarily a reflection. Culture wasn't necessarily a reflection directly of the CEO. And so it made me feel, yeah, I guess it reminded me of what Professor Sir Carey Cooper calls the line manager lottery, that, you know, our experience of work is more than ever, more than anything, is determined by our line manager, by our direct boss, more than anything else. So as a consequence, I was sort of very aware that, you know, I guess if anyone has studied economics, they would say sort of these macroeconomics and microeconomics. And, you know, I guess macroeconomics is sort of for culture. Macro culture would be to say that, you know, the boss creates the rules, the top-down values, things like that. But then this sort of microculture, microeconomics, which is that actually individual actions within teams can actually have a really big impact. And, you know, my feeling was resolutely that any individual could probably impact the culture that they worked in by having a discussion with the 5, 10, 20 people who they directly work with. And so, you know, 12 of the interventions in my book are just about beating personal burnout, trying to push back against personal feelings of being frazzled and exhausted by work. So I guess, you know, a lot of it was, it's almost, I saw it as like a cookbook for workplace culture. So it's, you know, with a cookbook, you don't necessarily read it cover to cover, but you see something that you want to create. You see something that you want to imagine up, and you set about trying to do it. And so, you know, the book was an attempt to try and give you that. It's like to say, okay, I haven't got time to do a whole book, 320-page book, but give me something that's going to make work better next week. And so it's an intention to try to allow people to it's a spell book. It's sort of a wizard's directory of spells, or witch's directory of spells, to try and improve your personal situation at work, really.
And that, what I think was great about that was that I imagine ironically, I've never actually worked in a big corporate, but I imagine that people often assume there's not much that they as an individual can do, certainly in terms of changing a team or a culture around them. So, but it's very encouraging that that's actually possible.
Yeah, I think, firsthand, one of the things that was most energizing and made me sort of feel that the approach was right was that I met one company of 70, 100 people, and the receptionist had changed the culture. And I thought, well, okay, if the receptionist, who for most people would be, if they perceived a hierarchy, would be very much at the bottom of the hierarchy. If the receptionist can change a culture, then it illustrates that actually we're just often just waiting for permission to do things. And there's probably far more scope for us to have an impact on our organizations than we might otherwise think. So, intriguing for me, because it forced a reappraisal of who can do stuff and what they can do, really.
So in your honest opinion then, because the dogma of the day is, everyone needs their why, everyone needs their mission, their purpose. To be fulfilled at work, do you think we actually need those things?
I think purpose is can be a bit of an illusion. So, most certainly what you discover is that if people feel a personal sense of purpose, then it can be helpful. But what happens is that these terms are sort of ineffectively and inaccurately packaged up by companies, and then they set about trying to recreate something, not necessarily following the line of evidence. So let me be specific. There's some wonderful research on purpose. So, Adam Grant is probably the world's leading workplace expert, and he did some interesting research into purpose. So what he did is he went into US college, and he looked to, even if colleges have fundraisers, some colleges have scholarships, and they actually raise the money to pay for those scholarships. So it's not always altruism. They have people phoning former graduates trying to raise money and what have you. And so he met those fundraisers who were trying to pay for disadvantaged students to go to college. And he did he separated the group into two. The first of whom had their manager come and tell them about one of the recipients of this free scholarship, and which is pretty classic of the way we do purpose, right? Would say, oh my God, this is the mission of this firm. Here's what we're doing. And the second group actually met the recipient of the free scholarship. So a case study of one versus the other. The team that met the recipient raised 3 times the funds of the team that heard the manager describe it. And this for me is like a perfect encapsulation of why we often talk about purpose, but purpose can be found, but it cannot be given. And I think it's sort of a really important distinction that, someone in your workplace can say, our mission is to do this, and I feel a sort of visceral connection with it. But you can't say to them, our mission is to do this, and expect it to have anywhere near the wholehearted, the full-blooded support. So I think, absolutely purpose can work, but I think as for most firms, it can end up leading to sort of a waste of energy, really, because you're trying to force people to believe in a certain way.
Mm. And do you think, you personally, that now that you're doing what you're doing, you've found purpose? Is that something before and after, perhaps?
Not necessarily. Not
difficult questions.
No. I'm sort of. I adore this stuff. If there was something that was going to be purpose-driven for me, it would be something slightly more ecological. But I adore this stuff, and I do think I'm fascinated with it. It's just I haven't yet found the way to like hit that Zeynep thing where it's like improving 10 million lives. I haven't yet found the way to feel like, wow, I'm changing people's lives here.
Well, you're certainly on the way. I can tell you that for free. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's important to us because we called the show Build Your Superpower, because we thought maybe there was a distinction between, do people just find superpowers out there, your purpose, like some mystical thing just waiting for you? Or does it, slowly creep up on you through the collection of life experiences? Or does it even exist? So, that's what we're trying to solve. And we've had a range of answers from, Guy Kawasaki saying it's just a lot of Silicon Valley bullshit a lot of the time, to what you're saying there, which is very good. So why do you think, ignoring purpose, that bad culture is so easy to come by in companies? Why do they slip into it so easily?
I think normally it's because they don't necessarily put it at the top of a hierarchy of priorities. Quite often there's an old truism, which is, a principle is only something when it costs you money. A principle is only a principle when it costs you money. And it's incredibly true. Like what generally you discover is that people will say, oh, this is our culture, or this is a value we believe. And then when you're confronted with it, you make a decision to do the opposite. I'll give you one illustration. Jack Dorsey was a really wonderful person to work for because, he's definitely he wasn't the finished article when he first came around, but now he's the CEO of two incredibly successful and world-changing companies, Twitter and Square, and he's the founder of both of them. To invent one multi-billion-dollar company is remarkable. To invent two is an extraordinary thing. Probably only him and Elon, I suspect, have done that. But so he. Incredible, but he used to have this philosophy that he said, look, we are going to be dependent on building trust with people. And so what we're going to start doing from now on is, the last couple of years, is that anytime we do something and we make a mistake, we're just going to tell people. And so one example, and sometimes some of the mistakes we were having to confess were things that other tech firms have had plenty of errors. So we had an issue where there was a small number of passwords that had been stored in an unhashed state. There was no evidence that anyone had accessed these passwords, but because of the way they'd been stored, it had been a possibility. So we'd exposed some users to risk, even though there was no evidence it had happened. And so when we set about doing it, now, inevitably, any discussion on this, someone will say, well, look, Yahoo had all of their users' passwords hacked. There was a major breach there. And, this affected the value of the organization. Do we really want to do it? And Jack was like, no. We committed. Our value is transparency. And so our value is transparency. Why are we having this discussion? And, it was a really interesting thing because what happened was we had 3 or 4 episodes like that in the course of 2 years. And the first time it happens, everyone, their heart races, everyone is in a state of anxiety. Everyone's worried that, wow, this is going to be a really difficult thing to do. Are we doing the right thing? Now, look, based on the value you've set out, based on the moral code you've chosen to judge yourself against, resolutely, this is the right thing to do. By the 4th time it happened, there wasn't even a debate. We're like, okay, this breach has happened. It's been a hack. Here's what's happened. Okay, so what we need to do is release it. Obviously, it could move the market, so everyone needs to commit that they won't, anyone who owns stocks have to commit they won't trade stocks. And so, but it's really instructive because it makes you realize that, having a principle isn't something that it's not like having a sort of favorite TV show that if you miss it, no hardship, you catch up next time. Having a principle is something that you are committed to. It represents part of your identity. And I think, that was really instructive for me to work with someone who knows that even though their actions might cause them short-term pain, they believe in the moral rightness of doing it. Is sort of very instructive. So I think, what often happens with culture is people believe it's a nice to have. They believe actually quite often it's a marketing device. It will attract people to come and work with them. And then when it comes down to it, they think, oh, actually, it might be easier for us to not do that anymore. So, it's just a good reminder. The difference between culture and not culture, or a principle and not a principle, is really how steadfastly you stick with it.
So we should really distinguish in our heads between purpose and values.
I mean, I think you can find. Yeah, I mean, look, yes and no. I can I get in such a tangle with people who set about saying, capital V or capital C, that this is what those things are. And I think, the truth about semantics and the truth about how we use those words is different people can use them in different ways. So I wouldn't want to necessarily be responsible for policing specifically what people do, but I do think that standing for something and resolutely believing in something, whatever it is a big differentiator.
What would be that for you, do you think? Your values, the thing you will commit to.
Very interesting question. I don't know really. In terms of, it probably has a big bearing in terms of my politics. It probably has a big bearing in terms of how I believe the natural order of society should be. So, I shan't sort of start going on to those things now because we'd run out of time. But, I think, I guess sort of your belief in what natural justice looks like, I think the big parts of those things really.
Yeah, and don't ask me back the question either, because I couldn't answer it right now.
The benefit of not being remotely reflective is, I go to sleep straight away. I never think about anything. Is that I don't have pre-packaged answers for some of these things.
Yeah, that makes it more fun as well, right? Like, who wants the perfect robot answer? My last question to you, just based on everything we've been talking about, what is your take then on ruthlessness in business? Whether it's necessary, effective, terrible idea, where do you stand on that?
Give me an example of ruthlessness. It sounds fucking awful.
Yeah, the word itself is just terrible.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm thinking is, you've got that classic scenario where someone's like, you've got to be cold. Like they say, those speakers, like, you've got to be a dick. You've got to take what's yours. Sometimes you're going to have to, like, I guess lying would be an example. Like, anything that seems like morally dubious, but those kind of those short-term gains where you screw someone over a little bit, and perhaps it benefits you, it benefits the company. And people seem to have different perspectives on it. Some people are like, it's necessary for business. Some people are like, it's the worst thing ever, you should never do it.
Yeah, there's a line in Othello, which I think Iago says, and he says, my reputation, I've lost my reputation, the immortal part of myself. And it truly is, your reputation is the immortal part of yourself. It lives on after you. It's eternal. You only have one reputation, and you can never recover these things. I've met plenty of those people who optimize for the hustle and optimize for sort of the deal and winning. And I don't like spending time with them. And, if that's what they need to do to be successful, I question how important success is. I'm not convinced that's the case, really. Certainly, I'm not interested in spending time with people like that.
That was beautiful. Reputation is the thing that lives on after you. That was like we actually planned it.
Well, it's a Shakespearean quote, so I guess you choose to commit these things to memory to some extent.
Bruce, this has been honestly so much fun. I've got a very quick game for you now. It's a quick bit of word association. I'll say 5 words. Just tell me the first thing that comes into your head after each one.
Okay.
All right, here we go. Work.
It's laughter for me.
Joy.
I didn't want to call the book that. Yeah, it's what a single word. Lifeblood. I'll say that one.
Leadership.
There's a phrase, servant leadership, so I'll say servant.
Okay. Company.
Yeah, team.
And lastly, it's a bit different. What's your superpower?
I people who know me well think I often affect quite a miserable demeanor, but I love laughing and I love being happy. So sort of laughter, optimizing for laughter.
Well, we definitely got that, Bruce, today. So thank you so much. That was
No
great.
worries. Good to chat to you again. Back in the since back in the time that you hit me up for LSE, right?
I know, yeah, exactly that. That was like, what, 3 years ago or something?
Yeah.
So it's great
Goes to show. There you go. I sort of said before, just do stuff. You hit me up, said, do you want to come in and do a talk at LSE? There you go.